Today we're going to talk about the different business units within the audit departments at the Big Four to hopefully give anybody slightly unsure of where exactly to apply to a better understanding to work with. Hi there everyone, hope you're all doing really well. My name's Matt, I'm an economics graduate and Big Four qualified accountant, and earlier this week I was asked in the comments to one of my previous videos around what an audit actually involves, which I can link up here. Someone wanted to know about the key differences between both the public and private sector sub-departments within the wider audit team, which I think is entirely fair because it's obviously a pretty important thing to understand if you're being asked to apply to a specific one. So what I'm going to try and do is outline three perceived pros of each of the two business units, which sort of by definition relate to a con in the other one. Hopefully that makes sense. So let's crack on. I'll start with public clients, also known as listed businesses, primarily on the London Stock Exchange. The first real pull factor of working on audits of this nature, I think, is the exposure to interesting areas of accounting which arise just through the complexity of these businesses that you're dealing with. They're almost always multinationals with a range of different departments and their fingers in loads of pies across the whole world. When I worked on FTSE clients, I was involved with the acquisitions testing, which meant liaising directly with Deloitte's internal valuations team, which was pretty interesting. And I know of other people who were responsible for overseeing a number of other small-scale audits of the subsidiaries of these bigger businesses, which might be spread across the whole country, and you're overseeing that process and liaising with all the respective individual audit field managers, both of which are probably pretty rare things to be exposed to, but also probably slightly more interesting than just your average day-to-day type of audit work. So yeah, I definitely think the complexity of these businesses means that you'll get to see things that if you were only dealing with more simplistic business structures you might not. Pro number two is the increased likelihood of international travel. Now this again is related to the fact that these businesses tend to have loads of stuff going on all over the world, and if a key jurisdiction is decided to require a physical presence, then obviously somebody's going to have to go on the trip out there, oversee things, and probably get a business class flight there and back as well. It is worth mentioning that it does tend to be the slightly more senior members of the audit teams that go on these types of trips, but not always. I mean, I was in my third year when I went on a sort of solo day trip to Zug in Switzerland, and there are certainly stories of second and third years spending weeks at a time in either the US or Australia, as and when needed. So it can certainly happen for younger members of staff. The final public pro I'm going to talk through comes down to the recognisability, if that's a word, of the names of the businesses you're working with and what that'll look like on your CV going forward. I think it's pretty difficult to argue with the fact that if you're applying for another job, say 5 years down the line, and your CV is littered with household names, at first glance you're already going to be one step ahead of somebody else who just hasn't had that sort of exposure. I do just want to caveat almost all of those 3 points that I've just mentioned really to say that there are certainly plenty of privately owned businesses that are huge in their own right and certainly would be able to probably also offer international travel and great name to go on the CV. But the thing is, not all private sector clients are huge, whereas it tends to be all listed businesses almost by definition are, so it's really a case of playing the odds to an extent. To move on to the private business unit itself, I think the first pro of this sector comes down to the diversity in the size of clients that you're actually working with. I don't think it's too much of a secret that at times the world of audit can become slightly monotonous. So if you're able to benefit from the fact that one week you're working on a smallish sort of growing tech startup and a couple of weeks later you might be moving on to a well-established construction company, then this sort of change of scene or change of pace is something that I think in the long run people do benefit from. What this means in practice is that you'll get to work with loads of different sizes of audit teams. So you might be a second or third year on a private client actually responsible for the on-site team of 3 or 4 people, which is just something that would never really happen on the FTSE side of things. One thing I really notice when working on these slightly smaller scale clients is that you can actually hold the entire audit in your head at once. You know exactly where everything's up to and what's going on, and that's something that you can only really do on these more manageable sizes of business. You start to build this sort of holistic understanding of how everything works within the business, and this sort of oversight is just not something that you're going to be able to gain really when you're responsible for a very narrow, focused, small piece of the pie part of the wider FTSE listed business audit. So private advantage number 2 relates to career development through the additional exposure you'll get to really senior client-side people. If you're in your 2nd or 3rd year and feel managing a medium-sized privately owned audit, then you're going to be liaising directly with the FD or CFO, whatever they're going to call themselves. But basically you're going to be in at the deep end managing the relationship with the most senior members of the client's finance function, which can be great for things like self-confidence, development, motivation. And this just is not how things work on FTSE clients, whereby the unwritten rule is that partners are very much responsible for dealing with CFO level people, and you as a more junior member of the audit team sort of stay in your lane and you're responsible for dealing with the more junior members on the client side, which can be slightly uninspiring, I think, depending on how you look at it, but I do understand from the partner's perspective why it probably needs to happen. My final pro for private is that the general workload and tightness of deadlines is probably slightly less. Now this definitely is a huge generalisation. There are plenty of really, really messy privately owned businesses out there which the audit can be an absolute nightmare on, but I think in general, on average, the hours are probably slightly less doing these sorts of businesses, especially during busy season. Typically, your listed businesses will have a public results announcement date in the diary from months and months out, whereby there's absolutely no room for negotiation on whether that's hit or not. And as you get closer and closer to this date, things start to get really hectic and tensions start to grow. In the case of private companies, I mean, there are still deadlines, there's still loads of work to get through, but I just generally got the impression that the deadlines tended to be slightly more flexible. I've heard things like finance directors say, oh, we're hoping to report to our German parent company the week commencing whatever, whereas listed businesses are already hoping to report, they are going to report on that date. So that was a pretty quick whiz through both of the sub-departments under the wider audit umbrella at the Big Four. I've got to stress it's really only possible to do this in sort of really general terms, so there'll certainly be anomalies and contradictions to what I've said, so please don't come back frustrated at me if you never end up anywhere near a business class flight having opted for the public department. That said, hopefully I have been able to add a little bit more flavour to what each department might involve and give you a steer as to which one might suit you best depending on exactly what you're looking for. At the end of the day, that's what it really comes down to. It's a case of personal preference and which pros you weigh more highly than the other. As always, any questions, comments or queries, let me know down below. I'd really love to chat. But other than that, that's all from me today though, guys. All the best till next time. Stay safe and bye bye.